My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We are coming down toward the close of our study of the resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I've been sharing with you some absolutely critical facts that we have to understand about this. That is, Paul posits the resurrection at the end of Old Covenant Israel's covenant age. Now, by the way, I want to say this just as kindly as possible. I fail to understand how one can take a position of accepting preterism and believing that the covenant which was the ministration of death, occurred at the cross, and yet the resurrection didn't happen until AD 70. I believe that's a false dichotomy. If Torah was the ministration of death, as Paul clearly says it was in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, then deliverance from that covenant of death, i.e. resurrection, would take place when that law was removed. If that law was removed at the cross, then that's where resurrection took place. But according to the testimony of the New Testament, the resurrection was still future well after the cross. And so it seems to me completely untenable to say that the law passed away at the cross and yet resurrection occurred in AD 70. That's a total disconnect. The law is what condemned. And that really brings us to an examination of what Paul says. We will discuss this more in depth tomorrow. But I want you to notice that Paul says, then comes the end. Well, the end of what? The vast majority of eschatologies, all three futurist eschatologies, say it's the end of the Christian age. It's the end of time. Well, unfortunately for those who make that claim, the Bible is emphatic that the Christian age has no end. In Hebrews chapter 12, 25 and following, the writer contrasts the old covenant heaven and earth that was delivered at Sinai, that was being shaken, i.e. removed, at the very time that he wrote, but they were, at the time that he wrote, receiving the kingdom that could never be shaken. Now that's a direct echo of Daniel chapter 2:44 and Daniel 7:13 and 14. They were in the process of receiving that when Hebrews was written. And what was the nature of that kingdom? What is the nature of that kingdom? It cannot be moved. Revelation chapter 11, 15 to 19. The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our God and of His Christ. He shall rule forever and forever. And according to G.K. Beale, F.F. Bruce, and a vast number of Greek scholars, world-class Greek scholars, that's the strongest Greek expression for endlessness that they had. There's the kingdom. There's the kingdom of God and of His Messiah. It's an endless kingdom. Well, guess what, folks? If the kingdom is without end, then the end in 1 Corinthians 15 is not the end of Christ's kingdom. It's not the end of the Christian age. Jesus said in Matthew 24 and verse 35, heaven and earth shall pass away. And no, that's not literal physical heaven and earth. But my word shall never pass away. Do you realize, folks? Do you realize that all three futurist views argue that Christ's word will in fact pass away? Go back to Hebrews chapter 12. The old covenant law, Torah, was being shaken. It was nigh unto vanishing away. Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 13. Now that did not mean it would no longer be on paper. It meant it would no longer be binding. It would no longer be serving the purpose that it had been given for. In other words, they would no longer practice it. No more temple, no more priesthood, no more cultus. So the passing away of Torah meant it would no longer function as originally divinely given and ordained and mandated. Okay, that's the passing away that's talking about. It's not removing it from a page. That's a ridiculous position. Jesus said, my word will never pass away. And yet, do you realize, have you ever thought, all three futurist views say that ultimately, at the so-called end of time, or at the so-called end of the Christian age, the word of Christ will cease to function. What do I mean? Well, they say, at the so-called end of time, there's no more sin. There's no more evangelism. Therefore, since there's no more evangelism, the word of Christ, the gospel of Christ, no longer functions as given. That means it would go the way of the Mosaic law. The Mosaic law passed away when it was no longer functioning as divinely mandated. Yet all three futurist views say the gospel of Christ in evangelizing the lost, ministering to the poor, there won't be any poor, there won't be any widows, there won't be any orphans, right? At the so-called end of time. And so the mandate for pure religion, which is undefiled before God and the Father, to visit the fatherless and the widows, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world, will go out of style, go out of function, will cease to function. And so Jesus' words in Matthew 24:35 fail. No. Now that tells us that the end, in 1 Corinthians 15:19 and following, is not the end of the Christian age, and it's not the end of time. Well, what end is it? We are told in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 55 and 56. And the promise of the resurrection. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? The sting of the death and the sting of the death is sin, the sin, and the strength of the sin is the law. The resurrection at the end would be at the end of the law that was the strength of sin. So between now and tomorrow, I want you to ask yourself the question, what the law did Paul consider the strength of sin? Well, I answer that question definitively in my book, The Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, Future or Fulfilled. You'll be absolutely amazed at how definitive, how powerful, and how irrefutable the evidence is for identifying the law that was the strength of the sin and the death. We'll see you on the flip side.